Under the Sate dynasty, beginning with Psamtik I, Egypt experienced what historians often call a renaissance of native rule, yet this revival was precarious. Archaeological evidence from Sais and Memphis shows extensive temple restorations, including renovations at the Temple of Neith and the mortuary complexes of Old Kingdom pharaohs. Trade networks reopened along the Nile, linking Upper and Lower Egypt, and Egyptian artisans resumed producing finely crafted jewelry, statuary, and monumental reliefs. These achievements suggest a temporary stabilization and resurgence of Egyptian cultural identity. However, the foundations of this restored Egypt were inherently fragile. The Site rulers, while Egyptian by birth, relied heavily on foreign mercenaries for military control. Greeks, Carians, and Libyans formed a significant portion of their armies. These mercenaries, skilled in new military techniques and equipped with advanced weaponry such as composite bows and iron-tipped spears, were loyal primarily to pay, not to Maat or the throne. Their dominance in the military reflected both necessity and vulnerability. Egypt could defend itself, but only so long as it could maintain alliances and the flow of mercenary loyalty. Beyond the military, Egypt faced a gradual cultural infiltration. Greek settlements along the Nile Delta, particularly in cities like Naucratis, grew during the Site period. These enclaves became centers for trade and Hellenistic cultural exchange, but also represented a shift in influence. Greeks were no longer occasional traders. They were permanent participants in Egyptian civic life. Papyrus records and inscriptions from this era reveal that Greek merchants held contracts for grain export, and some even gained local administrative authority, signaling a subtle but increasing erosion of purely native political autonomy. Economically, Egypt remained rich in agricultural productivity and gold resources, but internal structural weaknesses persisted. Heavy reliance on taxation to fund temple restoration and mercenary salaries led to social stress among peasant communities, a situation well documented in hieratic letters and ostraca excavated from site settlements. Scholars note complaints of unpaid labor, high grain levies, and localized unrest, suggesting that prosperity was unevenly distributed and fragile. This delicate balance was shattered in 525 BCE when Persia, under Cambyses II, invaded Egypt. Despite Egypt's storied history, the Sate military could not withstand the coordinated Persian forces. The conquest was swift, largely because Persian armies combined elite infantry, cavalry, and siege technology superior to the partially mercenary-reliant Egyptian forces. Inscriptions indicate that key cities such as Pelusium fell with little resistance, while Memphis was captured after only a brief engagement. The Persian rulers, forming what would become the 27th dynasty, did not present themselves as restorers of Ma'at, nor did they adopt Egyptian kingship rituals fully. They administered Egypt primarily as a province of the Achaemenid Empire, extracting tribute and overseeing governance through satraps. Yet even under Persian rule, Egypt retained traces of the Site cultural revival. Temples continued to function, art styles persisted, and Egyptian religious practice remained largely intact, although heavily monitored and taxed. Archaeological findings show continuity in temple hieroglyphics and ritual objects, suggesting that while sovereignty had shifted, Egyptian society adapted to new political realities, preserving identity through religion and localized governance. In short, the Sate dynasty demonstrated that Egypt could briefly reassert itself after the Kushite and Assyrian disruptions, but the combination of dependence on mercenaries, growing foreign settlement, and internal economic strain left the country vulnerable. When Persia arrived, Egypt's fragile autonomy crumbled, marking the beginning of a series of foreign dominations that would include the Second Persian period, Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies, and eventually Roman annexation. The lessons of the Scythe period reveal a civilization capable of revival, yet never fully insulated from external pressures, a reality that shaped the later course of Egyptian history. Egypt did not fall suddenly under foreign rule. It resisted, rose, and then finally reached a crossroads where the cost of war outweighed survival. Following the brief resurgence under dynasties 28, 29, and 30, native pharaohs attempted to restore ma'at, religious, social, and political balance, but these periods were fleeting. Archaeological evidence from temples in Thebes and Abydos shows restoration projects and renewed inscriptions celebrating native kings, reclaiming their ritual duties, and emphasizing continuity with the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Reliefs depict pharaohs performing traditional ceremonies, offering to gods, and smiting enemies, symbolic gestures meant to legitimize their rule and inspire unity. Yet these rulers faced enormous challenges. Oral Egyptian traditions passed through priestly families speak of the years of fading light, describing periods where authority existed only in temple precincts, while the countryside and trade networks fell into disarray. Grain taxes were high, borders were porous, and foreign mercenaries had already embedded themselves into local politics. Even though the kings attempted to rally the people, internal rivalries, weakened economies, and localized unrest made resistance fragile. When Persia returned in 343 BCE, led by Artaxerxes III, the conquest was devastatingly efficient. Archaeological findings in Suez, Elephantine, and the Nile Delta indicate rapid fortification and occupation, suggesting that Egyptian resistance was limited, likely constrained to small uprisings rather than full-scale military campaigns. Papyrus letters from the time reveal local governors and priesthoods negotiating with Persian officials, a clear sign that Egypt's institutions were now negotiating survival rather than asserting sovereignty. By the time Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BCE, Egypt was exhausted. The land had endured centuries of invasions, internal power struggles, and economic depletion. According to Greek historians like Aryan and Egyptian oral traditions preserved through temple priesthoods, Alexander was greeted as a liberator rather than an invader. Temples and priestly councils in Memphis and Heliopolis reportedly welcomed him, offering homage and resources in exchange for maintaining their privileges and continuity of religious practice. This welcome was strategic. Egyptian priests were highly influential, custodians of both spiritual and social authority, and their endorsement legitimized Alexander's rule in the eyes of the people. Archaeological evidence supports this. Inscriptions in Alexandria, Memphis, and Philae depict Alexander as a pharaoh performing rituals, wearing the double crown, and being recognized as the son of Amun, a powerful assertion of legitimacy, blending Greek authority with Egyptian religious tradition. Oral tradition preserves subtle details lost to written history. In some Nubian and Upper Egyptian chants, Alexander's acceptance is described as "the river bows and the land bends, yet the heart remains," a poetic acknowledgement that while a foreign king held the throne, the essence of Egypt's culture, memory, and priestly authority remained intact. This ceremonial endorsement ensured that temples remained autonomous centers of influence, and that daily life, agriculture, and local governance continued without the total upheaval seen under earlier foreign rulers. In essence, Egypt's embrace of Alexander was not a naive surrender, It was a calculated decision by centuries of entrenched priestly and local authority to preserve what could be preserved: temples, traditions, and the sacred order. Archaeology confirms this continuity. While Macedonian-style architecture and coinage appeared, the underlying Egyptian urban and religious layout remained unchanged, blending foreign administration with indigenous cultural resilience. This moment marks a turning point. Egypt was no longer fully independent, but it retained cultural sovereignty and spiritual continuity. Even under Alexander, the memory of the Kushite restoration, the Sate revival, and native resistance persisted in the temples, rituals, and oral traditions, silently asserting that while crowns could change hands, the soul of Egypt endured. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was not merely a conqueror. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, donning the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. This was no mere ceremonial gesture. Egyptian priests and local elites performed the rituals meticulously, officially recognizing him as the living embodiment of Horus on earth. Archaeology confirms this in temple reliefs. Alexander is depicted offering sacrifices, raising scepters, and wearing the Nemes headdress alongside pharaonic regalia, a symbolic fusion of Macedonian power and Egyptian divine authority. Yet Alexander's crowning also marked the first true separation between political authority and cultural legitimacy. Though pharaoh in title, his rule was contingent on the goodwill of the priesthood. He spoke Greek, commanded Greek troops, and his primary focus was empire-wide conquest, not the continuity of Egyptian governance. Ancient oral traditions collected in Upper Egypt hint at the duality of this period. Songs and chants passed down through temple families describe him as the foreign king who wears our crown but does not walk our land, emphasizing that while authority could be worn, the spirit of Egypt could not be fully possessed. After Alexander died in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy I Soter claimed Egypt. He founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek line of rulers that would last nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were masters of political adaptation. They adopted Egyptian royal titles, presented themselves as sons of Ra, and built temples dedicated to traditional gods like Amun, Isis, and Osiris. Archaeological evidence, particularly from the temple at Edfu and the temple of Philae, shows that Ptolemaic rulers actively participated in Egyptian religious rituals, offering gifts, performing sacrifices, and even commissioning inscriptions in hieroglyphs alongside Greek texts. Yet beneath the pageantry, the Ptolemies ruled through a foreign lens. Their courts were Greek-speaking, their advisors mostly Macedonian, and their policies often prioritized Mediterranean trade, Hellenistic culture, and dynastic marriages to consolidate power. Archaeology supports this dual identity. While temples were expanded in Egyptian style, city layouts, administrative records, and military structures reveal Hellenistic urban planning and governance. Greek influence dominated trade ports like Alexandria, turning Egypt into a Mediterranean hub, while much of the rural Nile remained under local priestly and village authority. The dynasty reached its dramatic end with Cleopatra VII, whose reign is often mythologized but also profoundly political. Cleopatra skillfully navigated alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, blending Egyptian religious authority with Roman political power. She claimed the throne not just by blood, but through ritual and the manipulation of her image as the reincarnation of Isis. Archaeological discoveries, such as coins and temple inscriptions, show her actively promoting Egyptian culture. She minted coins with her face wearing the royal Nemes, and temples were dedicated under her orders. Yet even Cleopatra could not prevent the collapse of sovereignty. After her defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Rome absorbed Egypt as a province. This was not just a political conquest, it was a cultural and spiritual subjugation. The pharaonic line ended, hieroglyphic administration waned, and Roman governors took control of the Nile's wealth. Oral traditions preserved in Upper Egypt mourned this as the day when the crowns disappeared and the river knew only strangers, reflecting the profound loss of self-rule. The Nile, once the lifeblood of pharaohs and Kushite kings alike, now nourished emperors who had never performed its rituals, never measured its floods, and never touched its sacred soil. Interestingly, despite this domination, Egypt's priesthood retained a measure of cultural resilience. Archaeological evidence from temples in Philae and Dendera shows that rituals continued, hieroglyphic inscriptions were still carved, and local festivals persisted. Oral traditions recorded that priests whispered, "The crown may pass, but the gods remain," a statement of continuity even under foreign rule. The Ptolemies and later the Romans could govern, tax, and trade. But the essence of Egyptian civilization, the religious memory, the alignment with Maat, the sacred connection to the Nile, survived in hidden continuity. Thus, the fall of Cleopatra was not merely the end of a queen, it symbolized the eclipse of native Egyptian political sovereignty, the final stage in a long series of foreign dominations that began with the Assyrians and continued through the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Yet archaeology and oral tradition remind us that while rulers changed, the spiritual and cultural foundations of Egypt endured, quietly influencing all who sought to govern the Nile. Even modern history played its part. Early European archaeologists, shaped by colonial ideologies, struggled to accept that African rulers from Nubia had ruled Egypt successfully. Kush was framed as derivative. Its achievements are credited to Egypt. Its kings were dismissed as imitators. But the stones disagree. So do the temples. So do the oral histories still whispered along the Nile and deep in Nubia. Oral tradition says Egypt did not fall first to foreigners. It fell to forgetting itself. And the Black Pharaohs were not erased because they were outsiders, but because they proved Africa had always ruled Africa. This has been the Calabash Diaries.